Um, so let's proceed, and the panel members, the panel members are coming up and having a seat here. And John Woodward, if you want to come on up, and we'll get started with our first panel. I'll mention that that our first speaker, Professor James Holmes, Jim Holmes, from the Naval War College, got to Pawtucket. He was feeling so ill, he turned around and went back, and so he's not going to be here this morning. But Professor John Maurer, who's the second one up, works with Jim, lecturing in the Strategy and Policy Department at the U.S. Naval War College. He knows Jim's talk. He will actually say Jim's words. Now, it's basically Corbett, the great naval tactician, who's the opener with Jim Holmes. Second is the strategist, Alfred Thayer Mahan, which is John Maurer. It's a great debate over what the impact of their thinking and thoughts are on naval affairs. And it happens that with John giving Jim's talk, we know who's going to win that debate today, because John is the Mahan professor at the Naval War College. So anyway, a preview. So why don't you come on up, and panelists, please have a seat. And you can see what the format is. You'll use the microphone here to speak, and then for the Q&A at the end, you'll be able to sit and answer questions.
Grant, is it okay if we start 2 minutes early?
Please.
It's like the Shinkansen. We have to wait till right at 9. We'll start early. So
You might end up in Hiroshima instead of Kobe.
Good morning, all, once again. And I have some really good news. I'm going to be very brief for this panel. I'm the moderator. My most important job is to serve as the timekeeper, to make sure that our distinguished guests adhere to their time limits, and I'll do that. I have my trusty chronometer here. But this panel will be talking about the war itself. We have distinguished experts. It's unfortunate that Professor Holmes is not able to join us, but I think we have a very worthy replacement with Professor Marr. So he'll be our doubleheader. It is the baseball season. This will be our doubleheader. He will start. He's going to give 15 minutes to each side, the tactical, the strategic. And then we will transition to Professor Kozyrev, who joins us from Endicott College. And if you've been to Endicott College in Beverly, Massachusetts, lovely place. Thank you very much. And also affiliated with Harvard University as an associate at the Fairbanks Air Base. Yes. And then we're very honored to have from Brown University, Watson Institute, Dr. Goldstein, who will be joining us. So that'll be the speaking order. Our first speaker will get 30 minutes because it's a doubleheader, and then 15 minutes and 15 minutes. I'll keep the time. I'll give you little signals and size and so on if you tend to go over. And then we will open it up to questions and answers from the audience. Okay. So that's the game plan. Let me turn it over to Professor Marr, joining us from the Naval War College. Thank you, sir.
Thank you, John. Let me go forward. Speaking for my colleague, Professor Holmes, who lectures on Julian Corbett at the Naval War College. Julian Corbett wrote a history of the Russo-Japanese War. It was not published in his lifetime. It was a classified history for the Admiralty. It was eventually published many years later by the Naval Institute in Annapolis. It's a big 2-volume account, and we read sections of it in the strategy and war course that we teach at the Naval War College. So this classified work from the time of the Russo-Japanese War remains very much a study that is worthwhile looking at today. It expresses a lot of Sir Julian Corbett's thoughts on naval strategy, maritime strategy. As Grant mentioned, quite often there is seen a rivalry between Sir Julian Corbett and his contemporary Alfred Thayer Mahan. Who is the best strategist on naval warfare, maritime strategy? Jim will tell you, and I agree with Jim, that this is a false rivalry that is often set up. Corbett himself said that 9 times out of 10, he would agree with Mahan and Mahan's strategic theories. So keep in mind there is actually a great deal of overlap between Mahan's thoughts, strategic theories, and Sir Julian Corbett's theories. Sir Julian Corbett, by the way, was trained as a lawyer, but he wasn't interested in the law. Instead, he took up a literary career. He wrote books of fiction and then gravitated toward naval history and became a celebrated author at the time. In fact, he was hired to be a professor of strategy at the British equivalent of the Naval War College before the First World War. And his classic work is Some Principles of Maritime Strategy, published in 1911. This book was read by Winston Churchill. Winston Churchill knew Sir Julian Corbett and liked Corbett's work a great deal. Corbett, in writing about the Russo-Japanese War, it's important to keep this in mind, is drawing lessons from this war that can be applied by Britain in some future war. So keep that in mind. This is not history for history's sake. It is history to try to educate naval officers in Britain to think about some future war. And in particular, at this point in time, thinking about some future war between Britain and Germany. Well, why was Japan successful in this war? And Corbett wants to highlight the success story of Japanese naval strategy during this war. He sees this as a model, in fact, for the type of strategy that Britain should follow in some future war. Again, he wants to highlight the lessons that can be learned from the Japanese experience in the war. One of the key elements that Corbett likes to talk about is not just how you get command of the sea, control the sea, defeat the enemy's fleet. He also wants to talk about how the Japanese Navy can work with the Japanese Army in combined operations, what the British would call combined operations, we today would call joint operations. How does the Navy and the Army work together? The key element in this war for Japan is to have local sea control, the waters around Japan, connecting Japan to the Korean Peninsula and to the Chinese mainland Manchuria. That's critical, so that the Japanese Army can then be projected ashore to achieve Japan's objectives in this war. And its overall objectives is to deny Korea and southern Manchuria to Russia. Russia was expanding at this time into China. The fear that Japanese leaders had that in the long run, Russia was also going to take over Korea as well. And so for Japan, it's key to make sure that Russia doesn't have control over southern Manchuria and Korea. So Corbett is writing about how the Japanese Navy can support the Japanese Army to seize this territory ashore. Again, he talks about this territory across from Japan in Korea and southern Manchuria that is important to Japan's security. Again, the topic is that Corbett's trying to talk about is how the Army, Japanese Army and Navy can work together to achieve their objectives on the mainland of Asia. Corbett also wants to highlight that these two services have to work together. The problem that armed services can have is that they might want to pursue divergent strategies. And that will be counterproductive. If you have an Army strategy, a Navy strategy, and they don't agree with one another, the result will you won't be able to achieve your overall objectives, your political objectives. For Corbett, the Army is being used to help support the Japanese Navy's objectives. And one of the key objectives in this is to destroy a Russian squadron that is based at Port Arthur. One of the criticisms that is raised of Japanese naval strategy in this war is that Admiral Togo, the commander of the Japanese naval forces, was too defensive in orientation. He wasn't aggressive enough. Corbett goes out of his way to defend Admiral Togo and say, that throughout this, Togo was very good at risk management. When to be aggressive, when to take risks, and when to be more cautious and prudent in his actions. I'll have more to say about that in a moment about Mahan. What Corbett wants to highlight is that overall, Japan's naval maritime strategy in this war is defensive, trying to control sea lines of communication between Japan and the mainland. Again, one of the criticisms of Admiral Togo was that he was too defensive, not aggressive enough, offensive enough in trying to seek out and destroy the Russian squadron based in Port Arthur. The problem was that Togo really couldn't do that because the Russian fleet generally stayed under the protection of the fortifications of Port Arthur. And when it did come out to fight in the Yellow Sea Battle of August 10, 1904, Togo was careful not to risk his fleet so that he would lose his own ships because he knew they couldn't be replaced. Again, here's a photograph of the famous Japanese Admiral Togo. And again, local command, controlling the sea lines of communication between Japan and Korea and southern Manchuria is good enough for Japan to be able to achieve their objectives. Let me go on. Corbett is also critical of Russian naval strategy. He has actually less to say about the Russian side than about the Japanese side. But the Japanese, his criticism of the Russian naval operations is that they were too defensive in this war. Now, there was one Russian admiral, Admiral Makarov, who was with the Port Arthur squadron. He was more aggressive in his orientation, but he was a victim of his own virtues. He sortied out on his flagship, the battleship Pavlovsk. It hit a mine, it went down with the admiral. Corbett said that, believed that if Makarov had survived, that Russia would have done a lot better in this war. In fact, maybe they could have won this war if there had been a more aggressive Russian admiral in charge of the naval forces in the Far East. For Corbett again, do something, just don't sit there. What eventually happens to the Russian squadron at Port Arthur, it is destroyed by the Japanese army that lays siege to Port Arthur and eventually brings some heavy artillery to sink the Russian warships at anchor in Port Arthur. Again, for Professor Holmes highlighting that at the Battle of Tsushima, what a knockout blow that was, where Admiral Togo becomes more aggressive against the Russian boulder that is coming around. Okay. Corbett, by the way, was a follower or reader, close student of the Prussian military theorist Karl von Clausewitz, and tried to adopt Clausewitz's strategic theories, apply them to war at sea. Corbett is quite explicit about the debt that he owes to Clausewitz. Clausewitz is another book that we read in the curriculum at the Naval War College. Alfred Thayer Mahan, by the way, tried to read Clausewitz and found it too confusing. He said, I don't get anything out of it, but I think there's other sources. Well, here's a photograph of Sir Julian Corbett, and I'll move on to my talk now about Alfred Thayer Mahan. Mahan, born in 1840. He is the son of Dennis Hart Mahan, who was a professor of engineering and tactics at the military academy at West Point. The Civil War generals who attended West Point were his students in the American Civil War. He was chosen to come to Newport to be a professor of strategy. There, the first professor of strategy at the Naval War College. And he was chosen in part because of the reputation of his father, Dennis Hart Mahan, being such a great teacher at West Point. In many ways, he exceeded what his father had done as a teacher. His most famous book is The Influence of Sea Power Upon History, which, like many great books, started as lectures to students at the Naval War College. Mahan wanted to reach a wider audience, though. He wanted to reach an informed public, and so he took his lecture notes and turned it into this book that was an instant classic when it was published in 1890. It's worthwhile noting, however, that Mahan sent his manuscript to several publishers who turned it down. They couldn't make sense of it. They didn't like it. Eventually, Little Brown Company in Boston took a bet on Mahan, and boy, it really paid off for Little Brown. Mahan overnight was a celebrity. His work of history that he did garnered him a reputation not only with people, reading public, but also within the academy. He was elected to serve as president of the American Historical Association, which says something about his reputation as an author. He was a prolific author, 20-some books, 130 plus some articles he wrote in his lifetime. He died in December of 1914. His most famous work, though, is this work, The Influence of Sea Power Upon History. The very first sentence of the book tells you the book's thesis. And it is that great powers are involved almost inevitably in clashes. And that the history of the international system is that of wars between great powers. And underlying the tension between great powers is economic competition as well. The book is very Darwinian in a very stark way. Mahan is writing to not only educate officers at the Naval War College, he's trying also to give a clarion call to the American public in the 1890s and at the beginning of the 20th century, that the 20th century, he predicts, is going to be a century of great power conflict, and that the United States will get drawn into these conflicts. In 1893, there was the Great Columbian Exhibition that took place in Chicago. The Great Columbian Exhibition was a world's fair to highlight American industrial, technological, agricultural power. Mahan's books, The Influence of Sea Power Upon History, is coming out at the same time when the United States is coming out in a big way, in a showy way, to say that the United States has emerged as an industrial power stronger than any other industrial, technological power in the world. It has supplanted Britain as the workshop of the world, the leading workshop of the world. Again, it's no accident that Mahan's books about how the United States is going to get caught up in these great power struggles coincides with the underlying changes that are taking place in the international economy. In one of the books, a collection of articles pulled together in a book, The Interest of American Sea Power, Present and Future, a very policy-oriented account where he highlights the United States is going to have to play a larger role in world affairs. The United States has to take control over the Hawaiian Islands. At this point in the 1890s, he's afraid that Japan is going to take over the Hawaiian Islands, and he wants the United States to have those islands to protect the Western Hemisphere, but also to be able to project American power across the Pacific as well. At this time, Mahan is saying in his articles and his book, is highlighting that the United States is going to have to play a larger role in world affairs, just because we have becoming an economic superpower. And the growing production of the country is going to demand it. There's something inevitable about further engagement and involvement of the United States in world affairs. In 1900, another book he publishes, again, collection of articles that he's written, called The Problem of Asia. What is the problem of Asia? Well, he sees Russia expanding throughout Asia from the Middle East all the way out to the Far East. And this is a zone between 30th and 40th parallels that he sees weak states that are going to be contested, part of the so-called Great Game between the British Empire and the growing Russian Empire. Now, for Mahan, the important stakes are out in the Far East in China. Will Russia become so strong that it becomes the dominant power in China? And can Britain somehow thwart or contain Russian expansion in Asia? At this time, Mahan and many around him don't think that Britain's up to the task, that other countries have to join in with Britain to contain growing Russian power. And what are those powers? Well, Mahan calls them the Teutonic powers, an alliance, if you will, not a formal one, but a combination of Germany, the United States, and Britain, because all of their interests are the same, which is to keep an open door in China and make sure that Russia isn't the dominant power in China. This is one of the key themes of American foreign policy, the 1890s down to our own time. What is the relationship between Russia and China? And can you keep those two countries apart from one another? Again, for Mahan, he sees Germany, the United States, and Britain having a common interest here in containing Russian power, sort of a proto-Atlantic alliance, except here projected out to Asia. At the time, of course, there were other people who were calling for this, most notably in Britain, Joseph Chamberlain, the father of Austin and Neville Chamberlain, was also thinking along these lines as well, that Britain has to have the support of Germany and the United States. Mahan also thought, though, that this Teutonic group should have Japan as a partner as well. So these four powers that he saw would be the powers that would be able to contain Russia in Asia. Again, not a formal alliance, but that the U.S. would be working with these three other powers. Now, Mahan's not the only one who's writing about this at the time. Brooks Adams, the grandson and great-grandson of two American presidents, is also writing about this in his best-selling book, America's Economic Supremacy. Again, people are aware of the growth of the United States as an industrial and technological power. And in it, the book, Brooks Adams highlights that the United States is going to have to buttress Britain in world affairs. The British-led international order needs to have support. Britain can no longer maintain it itself. And in particular, again, the fear that somehow Chinese labor put together in an industrial system that is hostile to the U.S. Is going to be of great danger to American security. Mahan in The Problem of Asia is also highlighting that at the core of this combination of Germany, Japan, Britain, and the United States, Britain and the United States are the two closest powers. There's an internal combination that's closer among those four. He's highlighting that the United States has to play this larger role in world affairs to uphold the international system. And Theodore Roosevelt, part of that circle, is also highlighting that the U.S. is going to have to take over the role that Britain has normally played of being the great balance of power force in the international system. Well, war. In February 1904, the war begins. The Japanese fleet undertakes an attack on the Port Arthur squadron of Russian forces. Mahan is highly critical of the Russians. They have a squadron of cruisers in Vladivostok and a battle fleet at Port Arthur. And Mahan says, like Corbett, that the Russians should have been more aggressive in the use of their fleet. Instead, the Japanese army is able to destroy the squadron at Port Arthur. And as you can see by Mahan's language here, the passivity of the Russian Port Arthur squadron, that they allowed their throats to be cut like stalled cattle. Again, that Russia should have been more aggressive in the use of their fleet in this war and not have it be destroyed in port. Now, one of the problems of Mahan's Problem of Asia is that he sees Germany as being a partner in this block? Well, we know that Germany is out to change around the international system, and just as much as said Russia is trying to do it this time. And here you see Kaiser Wilhelm and Tsar Nicholas in Russia together. Kaiser Wilhelm is encouraging the Tsar to go out in the Pacific. In fact, in one of his messages to his cousin, and remember they're cousins, Kaiser Wilhelm says, "I'll be the Admiral of the Atlantic, you be the Admiral of the Pacific." Well, the Russian Baltic Squadron that steamed 18,000 miles from the Baltic Sea, only to be destroyed in Tsushima, they would never have gotten there without the support of Germany. The Hamburg-America line is the line that carries the coal, the fuel that's required to send the fleet to the Far East. By the way, the coal that's being used by the Russian fleet is Cardiff coal. It's coal coming from Wales, from Britain, and carried on German ships to French ports in the French colonial empire. The last place the Baltic Squadron stopped was at Cambrai Bay in modern-day Vietnam. Russia and France were allies of one another. Talk about globalization here. You know, countries cooperate. By the way, the British didn't want to sell their coal to the Russians. They wanted to help their Japanese ally, but they couldn't keep track of where the coal was going. The Germans would buy it and say, "Oh, we're sending it to Hamburg, you know, to light up our factories and houses." But the reality was the coal was going, was also not only going to Hamburg, but also to the Russian squadron in the Far East. Well, here's Togo with Akiyama right next to him on the bridge of the Mikasa, steaming into battle against Admiral Rozhesvensky's Baltic Squadron, the famous standard launched by, hoisted by Admiral Togo before the battle. Very much like Admiral Nelson at the Battle of Trafalgar. You know, everyone is expected to do their utmost duty, to do their duty. Togo very conscious of this naval history, wanting to have a Japanese Trafalgar here over the Russian force. Togo, great admirer of Mahan's works, seeing himself as a Nelson, pulling off the big battle in which the enemy's fleet is annihilated, and that's exactly what happened. There were 7 Russian battleships against 4 Japanese battleships. First-class battleships. There's more Russian ships than that. But these are the main Russian units. Look what happens to them. 5 sunk, 2 captured. The Russian Baltic Squadron is destroyed in this battle by Admiral Togo. It's a great example of an overwhelming, crushing defeat being inflicted upon an enemy, which set up the Treaty of Portsmouth and Theodore Roosevelt being able to bring these 2 countries to the table, both countries realizing that a continuation of the war was in neither of their interests. The Treaty of Portsmouth being signed here, as you can see, Sergei Witte there, the Japanese delegation. Now, lessons for America. The Russian fleet was divided between the European waters and Asian waters. For Mahan, trying to give lessons for Americans is that in the future, before the Panama Canal is finished, that the U.S. Navy should not be divided between the Atlantic and the Pacific. Concentration of force is key. It's key to him. He believes that Russia lost the war because it didn't keep its fleet concentrated, either in European waters or out in Asian waters. If they had, the Russians would have had a more than 2-to-1 superiority in naval strength over Japan. Japan would not have been able to get control of the sea lanes in Northeast Asia. Now, there's some problems with Mahan's strategy. Could you swing all these forces from Europe? But nonetheless, this is the big lesson that Mahan is trying to draw away for an American audience. And again, it's a vital consequence that the American people know this. He's afraid, by the way, that public opinion will call for a division of the fleet. That if the fleet is concentrated in the Atlantic, the people who live in California, Oregon, Washington will say there's no Navy here to protect us. That the fleet should be divided. And he says, no, we don't want to do that because if we do, the result will be that the United States could be defeated in some future war. After the Russo-Japanese War, Mahan comes to a conclusion that the bloc that he had called about in the problem of Asia, of the Teutonic powers and Japan, that was no longer viable. After the Russo-Japanese War, he sees Japan as a rising power on the world scene that can threaten American interests in the Far East and China. And so he looks and says that Japan is a potential enemy, not a partner. More importantly for Mahan, he's very frightened by the rise of German power. From 1908 on, Mahan's articles are, he's maintaining a drumbeat, which is that Germany is going to be the next enemy of the U.S. and that Germany is the main threat to the United States in the 20th century. A Germany first strategy, if you will. So Mahan, his views changed from the time of the problem of Asia to where 8 years later he's looking at a combination of Japan and Germany as being the most dangerous threat to the United States, not Russia. And on that, thank you.